Welcome to The Whole View. I'm Stacy Toth of Real Everything, and I'm here each week to dive deeper into how we can find happiness and health inside and out through self-love, body positivity, and discovering new ways to be our best selves. Before we get started, a reminder, this podcast is for general educational purposes and is not intended to diagnose, advise, or treat any physical or mental illness. And we always recommend that you see a licensed health professional accordingly. While I'm issuing reminders, could I please remind you to leave a review in Apple Music or Spotify or however you're listening to the show today? It has a huge impact on our ability to help others find our content, and ultimately, you're paying it forward to someone else's happiness and health. Today, we are talking with Susanne Mitschke. She is an award-winning entrepreneur and immigrant, calling LA her home since 2017. She's been featured on Forbes 30 Under 30 lists twice. And as a VC-backed entrepreneur, she leads Citruslabs as co-founder and CEO. Founded in 2015, Citruslabs is the fastest growing provider of clinical trials for brands, and it has supported over 500 clinical trials with 150,000 participants enrolled, covering supplements, skincare, medical devices, CBD, pet wellness, and FDA regulated products and treatments with brands you would recognize. I have talked about Dame on the show before, a prior podcast partner, my beloved beekeepers. I love them. We the People is a shaving brand I've personally recommended, as well as Prima CBD, a brand I use, Supergut, Poppy, a lot of different brands that I'm familiar with, and I'm sure listeners you would be too. Even Bite, who makes the amazing toothpaste tabs and other non-toxic products. In fact, 97% of the brands rated their experience with Citruslabs as excellent. So it can be a win for both consumers and brands to focus on safety. And I'm excited to talk about that with you today, Susanne, to see a little bit behind the curtain on the other side of what it really means to talk about consumer safety and efficacy, both things that we as consumers want when we're spending our money on products that say that they do something for the benefit of our health. The work that you're doing is ensuring that is the case and that the products, do what the brands think that they're doing as well. So I'm wondering if you can share with listeners a little more about yourself and how you got started with what is called Contract Research Organization, or CRO, the work that you're currently doing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this great introduction, Stacy. Really excited to be here. And as you can hear, I have an accent, and everybody's always super interested where this accent is from. I was born and raised in Germany, and after high school, decided to leave Germany to go to college and then grad school, and first lived in Austria and then Scotland, and then came to the United States. Uh, as you mentioned, I call Los Angeles my home since 2017, and I'm a proud Angelino. And after college, I worked a little bit in management consulting. It was not really my bliss. I then moved to Scotland and had an idea for a health app that would support people with dementia. And we created a lot of buzz around this app, especially in the United Kingdom, and then brought this app to the United States. And we found an amazing way to monetize this through clinical trials. And we're placing app users in clinical trials and working on a big problem called patient recruitment. I then got sucked deeper and deeper into this world of clinical trials. And apart from participant recruitment, got also involved in study design, trial logistics, data collection, data analysis, and eventually we found ourselves conducting studies from start to finish. And when I moved to the United States, I thankfully made a lot of friends. And some of these friends went on to start businesses in the health and wellness industry, and in particular in skincare and supplements. And these companies are science forward, which means they not only wanted to include safety testing for their products, but also efficacy testing. And they got quotes from contract research organizations, CROs, that were already in the space and were asking me for help, for guidance as they were navigating this process. And I honestly was shocked when I was seeing these quotes. They were very expensive, very long lead times to get the results. And to me, coming from the FDA space, this really did not make any sense. So I asked them if they would be comfortable if Citruslabs would conduct their studies. And they said yes. So we conducted these studies from start to finish at a fraction of these costs and way faster than the other CRLs were quoting. And they were really happy and recommended us to their brand friends. So we did the same thing with a bunch of other brands. And then these brands were happy and recommended us to their friends. And this is how we grew this health and wellness arm, and then also decided to drop the pharmaceutical business entirely, because working with brands is not only fun, but we can actually make a big impact also for consumers. And that was what I got really excited about.
Yeah, I love the idea that it's accessible for brands, right? That you found ways to not overcharge and to simplify so that more brands can ensure that their products are safe and effective.
Mhm.
Because ultimately, I believe that in a capitalist society, you want your product to work well so that the consumer will buy it again, right? I think oftentimes we as consumers think, oh, I intentionally got tricked and this thing doesn't do whatever. But I think really the root of most ethical brands that we want to believe in are wanting their product to perform the way that they think that it will to solve the problem that we consumers have, and that we will have such positive results that we will come back for more. We'll tell our friends about it. We'll review it. Right. And that's how the growth of a brand works. And so if they have a product that is not safe and needs recalled, or has a product that isn't effective, they're not going to have that success and that growth. And so where I think sometimes there can be misalignment with the belief that testing costs extra money and brands can't afford it, and some of the limiting beliefs around the work that you do, but also just in general that consumers are fighting for on the Hill, right? Like I partner with a brand where we lobby on the Hill for safer regulation around personal care products, and supplements and all these kinds of things often get tangled up in bills and different things together. And so for me, I love to see that there are accessible win solutions, that when a consumer finds a brand that is safe and effective, it can propel them forward in the market to be more profitable. That it's not this scary idea of, well, that's going to hinder me and I'm not going to be able to be an effective, successful, financially stable brand if I do that. And the work that you're doing proves that is not the case, right? You've partnered with a bunch of brands that are doing well and are seeing positive results from consumers. I wonder if before we jump into everything else, if we could just maybe even start with the very basic, what is a CRO? I know you talked about the work that you're doing and data analysis and all that stuff, but just what is, in a nutshell.
RO stands for Contract Research Organization. And I think in previous episodes, I heard you use the term contract manufacturer. And contract research organization is the same thing, but it's about research. The brand is outsourcing their research to a third party like Citruslabs. And this allows for the research to be more unbiased, be more credible. And frankly, also many brands have maybe one scientist on board, and running a clinical study is more than just a bunch of questionnaires that get sent out. Apart from getting the research question right and designing the study, there are also lots of logistical things, from recruitment to distributing the test product to getting people to take blood tests to collecting all of the data, analyzing the data. And in our specific case, we also make sure that the claims brands make about their products aren't just marketing fluff, but are actually supported by scientific evidence. So a CRO takes care of all of these things to make clinical studies run smoothly. It's again study design, ethics approval, recruitment, retention, data collection, data analysis, and then also conveying this scientific information to brands so that they can make substantiated product claims.
I hear all of that and I'm like nodding along fervently because I am so into the work that you're doing. However, I think a lot of consumers would assume that work is happening for everything that they purchase or consume, that it would be a requirement for something to be on the shelf that goes on their body or in their mouth
Mhm.
to have been tested as safe. So, can we talk a little bit about why a brand would need to work with a partner like Citruslabs and that they're not automatically doing this themselves as part of FDA or other requirements?
So many people are often shocked by this, but as long as you are not an OTC product like a sunscreen, you actually don't need efficacy testing. And efficacy testing isn't even part of something like the new FDA guidelines like MOCRA. And to just quickly explain the difference between safety testing and efficacy testing. Safety testing is that the product doesn't do any harm, like toxicology testing, which is typically not done on humans, but product samples are sent into a lab, then there's samples analyzed. And then there's something called HRIPT testing, the patch testing, that is done on humans, but it only helps to make safer product. Now, efficacy testing means that does the product actually work? And are the claims brands are making substantiated by clinical trials? Typically, efficacy testing includes stuff like reduced wrinkles for cosmetics or more energy for supplements. And this is what we do, efficacy testing through human clinical trials. And I quickly want to talk a little bit also about MOCRA because I think a lot of consumers think, cool, now we have MOCRA, everything is solved. Now, MOCRA is about cosmetics. It doesn't include supplements. MOCRA is about safety. It's about that the ingredients of products are safe, that they don't do any harm, and that they don't contain any carcinogens like benzene. So according to these guidelines, brands have to do safety substantiation, but MOCRA doesn't really tell you which substantiation should you do, right? There is no guideline on you have to test your ingredients with this specific toxicology test and show us that it's safe. Instead, brands can use available safety data on ingredients. They can use data from the ingredient supplier. They can also look at existing research. But again, it's all about safety. It doesn't tell us if a product actually works and does what it promises to do. It just tells you that it is not harmful. And this is where Citruslabs comes in. We do the efficacy testing and we do this through human clinical trials. And there are different study designs and different methodologies. So typically the gold standard of efficacy testing is to conduct a randomized controlled trial, or short RCT. Here we have at least two groups, an intervention group that takes the actual product, and then we have a placebo group or control group that takes a placebo. And the study participants then have to complete a bunch of questionnaires. They also include sometimes biological samples, which can be blood tests, stool samples. Stool samples we often see in probiotic testing, for example. We can also utilize digital markers for sleep trackers, for example, or for smart scales or blood pressure devices. And typically, we are blinded, which means that we and also the participants don't know which product is the placebo and which product is the actual intervention, which helps to be less biased when analyzing the data and coming to a conclusion about the efficacy as well. Now, the supplement industry really exploded during COVID, and there was the Wild West when it comes to product claims. Some claims did not go unnoticed by the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, which regulates supplements. So the FTC also came forward in December last year in 2022, similar to MOGRA, with new guidelines on substantiation for product claims. And now every health claim that a brand makes must be substantiated by a gold standard clinical study, which is typically a randomized controlled trial. And the FTC is really behind all of this. Earlier this year, they sent out 700 warning letters to brands. But in the latest development, this is being challenged now by a citizen petition. It's a really exciting time when you work in supplements, and there's a potential for this to getting changed again. But before these guidelines, some brands were conducting studies, also conducting gold standard studies, but it really wasn't that common. I have seen many brands that were citing consumer surveys as clinical studies done by their in-house marketing teams, for example, which is something that you shouldn't do. But the thing is, even under these guidelines, brands can still substantiate their claims also with existing literature, which means that studies that were already conducted with the same active ingredients. So even though we now have this regulation now, many brands still get out of actually testing their products in human clinical trials. And I think that this is absolutely fine. But I also believe that consumers have the right to know, instead of just saying clinically proven or clinically tested and then just throwing a bunch of claims at us without any background knowledge. I think brands should have a minimum transparency when it comes to who conducted the study. Was it done in-house by their own research team? Was it done by a third-party CRO? How rigorous was the research in terms of study design? Did the study only include questionnaires, or was there real objective data involved on the sense of biomarkers like blood tests? Or did they actually use existing research to substantiate their claims? And all of this, I think, would make the industry a little bit better.
100%. And the idea of something like a blood test or a stool sample are the things that I want in a brand, that, especially if we're consuming something like a supplement because we're trying to improve our health, right? What we don't want is something that's going to cause harm because there's contamination or different kinds of things in
Yep.
there. And even a brand who's trying to do right? Like, there were so many sunscreens that had benzene found in them. I think it was
Yeah.
last year or the year before.
Mhm.
Those brands didn't intentionally put a carcinogen in their product. Like, they weren't trying to harm people, but there was extensive contamination because there
Yep.
wasn't safety testing before it was out. And like you said, while MOCRA, which is the Modernization of Cosmetic Regulation Act, which went into place at the end of 2023, if I'm remembering. No, 2022. I'm
22.
like,
Yeah.
last year. It's at the end of last year. And so brands have until 2024 for some of these things to start taking place. So even this year, even though it was enacted at the end of last year, it's still not in place. And even when it is in place, it doesn't fully address, like you were saying, so many
Mhm.
things. And one of the things that doesn't touch on at all is supplements. And I know a lot of us who are focused on our health and non toxic living are taking supplements, whether it be probiotics, whether it be fish oil, different kinds of things. And the idea that some of these brands that are on the shelf have not done any sort of safety or efficacy is concerning, because if they're taking the word of their manufacturer or their ingredient provider, when we go into auditing of a lot of these providers, we find that there is contamination, there is oxidation, there is concerns about worker safety, right? There's concerns about sustainability. Like, there's so many things that a brand can turn a blind eye to, I'm not thinking about that because it's coming from somebody else, that I'm going to take their word for it. And oftentimes these providers aren't US based. And
Mhm.
so the rules and requirements that they have to abide by are different. And as a consumer, it is nearly impossible to know all of that just by looking at the label on a bottle of a supplement or on your skincare product or whatever it is you might be doing. And I think that's what concerns me, is that it takes a lot of self advocacy and knowledge in order to navigate the system the way that it's set up. And while I think listeners of the show are educated and are working on learning these things so that they can improve their situation and consume brands that you partner with and other brands that are out there who are doing safety and efficacy of their own. I think for the majority of Americans, this is not information that people have. And so they're walking into their local marketplace,
Mhm.
especially if it's a not high end, right? If we're talking about something that isn't something that their doctor prescribed that they can only buy online, right? If they're walking into their local store and buying a supplement off the shelf, the claims that are made by most of those brands have not been validated in the ways that you're talking about. And the products themselves have not been tested for safety or contamination.
Mhm.
And it breaks my heart that the most accessible products, the most available, the most consumed products are the ones doing the least amount of work to make sure that the products are doing what they're telling the consumers they're doing in a way that protects their health. And that just like boils
Mind
my blood.
blowing.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's so frustrating.
It is frustrating. Yes, I hear you, especially when it comes to safety testing, right? MOCRA, as I mentioned before, MOCRA now is asking for the safety substantiation, the safety testing, but it's still, you can just get something from your manufacturer and then we don't know the standards of the manufacturer, right? Especially when they're outside of the United States. And that is something, it is the intention of MOCRA is good, but then the implementation, I think, is lagging a little bit behind.
And brands will find every loophole they can, right? And so
100%. Yes.
it's, oh, now if I just outsource this ingredient or the manufacturing process, then I don't need to be accountable and responsible for these new regulations, instead of understanding the intent and what a consumer wants, what the regulation intends, which is to actually look into it to protect us, right? So I'm wondering, earlier you were talking about differences between the kind of work that you do. Specifically, you've mentioned clinical research, clinical trials, consumer perception studies is another one that we see come up. What are the differences in all of these terms? Like you said, sometimes it's a stool sample, sometimes it's a randomized control trial, but sometimes it's not, right? What are all of these things and how do they actually serve us as consumers on products?
Clinical research is the field, which means the broader term, and clinical studies is a subset of clinical research that refers to efficacy and safety testing. It differs from safety testing we see in most cosmetics because these are not tested through human clinical trials, but mostly through toxicology studies in the lab, right? You mentioned the sunscreen from last year or 2 years ago that found a lot of benzene. That was not done through human clinical trials, but actually through in vitro and lab testing. And clinical trials imply that the research was actually done on humans. And clinical trials can also come in many shapes and forms with different methodologies, which means how data is collected. And we have single group clinical studies where we have one group using the product and there's no control group, no placebo. Then we have the randomized control studies, the RCTs, in the form of, for example, a 2-arm study with one group using the product, the other group using a placebo. These studies can also have more than 2 arms. And then we also have something called a crossover study, which is part of the randomized control trial family, where we have one study group that goes through the intervention and the placebo. And then, different methodologies for all of these designs include questionnaires, biomarkers like blood, stool, skin swabs, skin analysis, expert grading. Oftentimes, expert grading you see when you're seeing claims in the cosmetic field. And then we also have digital markers from trackers and other smart devices as well. And based on the FTC guidelines, if a brand makes health claims, they now have to have the substantiation of a randomized controlled trial. And unfortunately, these studies are very expensive, and many brands want to include biomarkers in their research, but then can't afford it. They can only afford a single group study with biomarkers. And in my opinion, a single group study with biomarkers is better than a questionnaire based randomized control study. But I guess we see how these different designs play out as brands get challenged by the FTC. And now, the other thing that often pops up, specifically in cosmetics, is consumer perception studies. These studies are not scientific, they are purely subjective and typically include a nice set of before and after photos. And we typically see them only in cosmetics. It's a set of questionnaires with which you can create claims like, do you agree or disagree that this moisturizer helped with your dry skin? And what I actually like about brands that work with perception studies is that they are typically very straightforward that, okay, we have these claims and they actually come from a perception study. And in my opinion, if you disclose it, it's fine. But for consumers, perception studies are not clinical studies. They are not scientific, but they can give us a really good understanding about the product's efficacy from a user perspective.
If I were manufacturing a skincare product, I would want both a clinical trial
Mhm.
and a consumer perception study because I would want the science to show me that it's safe and effective, but I also want to ensure that my consumer is, oh yeah, my skin feels good, right? Like
Yeah,
seems
definitely.
that seems basic, but evidently not.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's not. Especially for cosmetics. I think for cosmetics, safety testing is really important. But I understand that many brands don't opt for full blown clinical study, specifically with something like skin analysis, because so when you objectively look at wrinkles, for example, when your wrinkles objectively get 20% better, that is huge, but it doesn't make for a great claim, right? Objectively, my fine lines around my mouth got 20% better. Great. But then you have a consumer study, and then you have 86, 89% of consumers say that their fine lines got better, just makes for a better claim. The end result is the same, but I agree that you should 100% have safety testing as a minimum and then add something like a perception study to it.
And for something like supplements, how do clinical trials work? So, for example, I'm thinking of not just did my energy increase, which could be a perception study, but I mean something like if you see on a label where a brand is saying that it's a more absorbable version, or theirs is better than somebody else's by some sort of other measurement. How are those clinical trials, we as consumers, right? Like, how are we supposed to interpret that information as being validated by science? Hopefully, a clinical trial that you're looking at. How could we read that label and be like, oh, that's just some random words someone put on there from the marketing
Mhm.
team versus, oh, this is actually going to be better for me?
Yeah, I love the words absorption and another buzzword is bioavailability. But for consumers, It's really important that you think about what does that actually mean? How does this product contribute to my health and wellness? And for example, a supplement is not allowed to diagnose, to treat, or to cure condition. When I have a probiotic, I want to check if this probiotic can actually help me as a healthy consumer, right? Yeah, supplements should keep healthy people healthy and not cure sick people. So, for example, a probiotic, can it help with Crohn's disease? Probably not. Also, for the brand, it probably doesn't make any sense to run a study about this. So the brand shouldn't go after Crohn's disease, but it would make more sense to go after symptoms like regular bowel movement, less gas, less bloating, overall better well-being. And we often have the situation that brands have anecdotal data in terms of reviews, in terms of comments under ads. And oftentimes brands get excited about this, and rightfully so, because it's exciting to hear these stories. But then they make the mistake of generalizing this very anecdotal data. For example, when someone says, I had thinning hair, and now I use this supplement and my hair grows back. Is it because of the supplement? Is it because the person's thinning hair was stress or trauma related? And now that they feel better mentally, would this have happened anyway? Is it because they maybe changed also their diet, started to exercise, reduce daily stresses? We don't know, right? And when you think about this, it is very important to actually disclose the research question. What was your research about? So, when you think from a consumer perspective, right, um, it also is about study design. So, as I mentioned before, best in class study design is a randomized controlled study that is double blind, that involves the placebo. Studies should also involve biomarkers, but again, these studies are also very expensive and not every brand, unfortunately, can afford them. But again, transparency is key. It's also super relevant for consumers. And I often have to cringe when I browse websites and then brands have claims next to their product. There's asterisks to it. And then it leads me to based on a third party conducted clinical study without any further information. So consumers should ask questions, right? First, is this existing research? Is it ingredient research? Or was there actually a study conducted on the actual product? What was the study design? How were the participants selected? What were their criteria? What was the methodology behind the study? Who conducted the study? Again, what was the research question? And how long was actually the intervention period? And in my opinion, consumers deserve to know. And also to me, it's always a red flag when brands don't tell us more about their studies and when we can't find these studies anywhere, like on clinicaltrials.gov. So clinicaltrials.gov is a central database on clinical trials. I think all clinical trials are listed there. And many brands actually do a great job also having these dedicated clinical study pages where they include all of the relevant data. But others, I feel their research is a big secret, which is a bit weird and makes me wonder why. And also, one thing for me that is a red flag as well is when they are claims that are in the very, very high 90s or even in the 100%. And I think I saw it twice in our study, a result of 100%. And we actually couldn't believe it. And we ran different statistical analysis to make sure that this is actually correct. But especially in cosmetics, I do see a lot of 100% claims, and I often doubt these results.
I I think that all of the information that you provided about the studies makes a lot of sense. However, hearing it and like most people are not going to know all of that or remember all of that or even know how to go about where to ask those questions, right? If I,
Mhm.
as educated as I am, if I'm looking at a bottle and there's an asterisk and then it says, based on a third party clinical study, I would be like, check the box, right? Like, I wouldn't then be like, okay, now I'm going to go to their website and I'm going to look up the results of all their studies. I often do that, but not on everything that I'm consuming, right? And so maybe you could just give us the high level, like how to be an educated but also not paranoid consumer because we don't right, like, we don't wanna be extra stressed and, be like, "Well, I couldn't find this 4th question that I was asking about a study." Like, where do we even go about finding that information? What do you look for in a brand that Citruslabs hasn't run through, but you're like, "Oh, I'm interested in this brand." Like, how do you go about looking up that information?
So I really look about basically what I'm doing is I see how the brand is treating research. As I mentioned before, many brands are keeping their research a secret. They are not telling us anything about it. So when a brand has a dedicated research site, typically that's a really good sign. Then if the actual clinical trial is also listed on clinicaltrials.gov, that's an even better sign. So like at the minimum, if you are in a store and you are not sure if you should buy a product or not, I hate to do it, but I do it all the time. I just take my phone out and I just check out the website. If there's a dedicated clinical study page versus just these are our claims, and this is done by a third party, then this is typically something like, okay, so they're actually not proud of their research. They just did it to get the claims, and we don't really know what the research was about. But if they have a dedicated page, and typically this dedicated page gives us more information about the study and also have the link to something like clinicaltrials.gov, you can just go on there. It is free. You can type in the brand name and see if something pops up. And if they have both of these things, and this is typically a really good sign that they are not only using research for marketing, but they are actually standing behind their research.
And when we're looking at that, I know you talked a little bit about the randomized control studies and trials that you're doing, but what would be some of the best in class standards that we as consumers, while we're on clinicaltrials.gov, for example, what are we validating? What are we looking at to see if something is legitimate?
So generally, if you actually are on clinicaltrials.gov, that study, regardless of which study design the brand chooses, is actually legit. So to get on clinicaltrials.gov, so you cannot just put any research on there. So the research has to go through an ethics approval so that there's no harm to study participants. And then clinicaltrials.gov reviews each study carefully before actually putting it onto their platform so that they can make sure that this is actually a clinical trial versus more like a consumer friendly consumer perception study. So if a study is on clinicaltrials.gov, it is fairly legit, giving that language here.
Okay, so then what if it's not on clinicaltrials.gov, right? Like it's on their website or because I know that I use brands that are using clinical trials or perception studies that they're either using a third party like Citruslabs or they have an in-house team, not just one scientist, but let's just say like an in-house team of scientists
Mhm.
who are dedicated to those kinds of things. What are some of the gold standards of what we would be looking for when looking at their information, right? Like we go to their website and we're like, "Oh, good, they do have a page talking about the studies and the work that they're doing to ensure efficacy and safety." What are some of the maybe red flags that we would see that would be like, "Oh, that's marketing stuff," versus kind of green flags? Yes, they've taken this seriously and they care about these results for us.
So green flag. is all about transparency. The more transparent and the more information someone gives you about a study, the better it is. So when you go on a website and you see a clinical trial page, or oftentimes they also call it the science, for example, then you go on there and the more information you have, the better. And typically, a lot of brands actually do a really good job with these pages. So they typically tell you about which design they've chosen. They tell you about the inclusion exclusion criteria. They even give you raw data. Sometimes I see graphs or just snapshots of statistical analysis, for example. So this is for me, this is a green flag. But red flags typically are just, as we see it also in many brands, unfortunately, just throwing a bunch of claims on their website. For example, reduces gram during menstruation, reduces headaches, stuff like that. And then just putting that asterisk on there and it says, based on a third party clinical study. And that is something that just raises a lot of questions. And I don't believe that this study was, they probably have the research, probably have the substantiation, but this to me raises the question if this was actually their product versus was this based on literature review. And sometimes also these studies are actually published. So if a brand has a study, that study got published, then typically they also add the link to a published study, which is really the best in class. But when you just want more information on the study and they don't have that, then this is typically a red flag.
I get so excited when I go to a brand's website and they're talking about what their product does or
Mhm.
the claims that they're making. And then there's a link to the actual study. I'm such a geek. I'm like, yes, I go to the actual study and I read the things. And even then, I will say that a lot of brands have taken some liberty with the claims that they're making versus what the study actually proved. And so I will just say that as a consumer, we also just need to be aware that, of course, brands are out there to sell their products. And
Yes,
if they've gone to all of the extent, like study and, to all of these efforts, I try to remind myself that, okay, that's a little bit of a stretch, but at least it's safe. At least it's whatever. Right. And sometimes too, the limitations of clinical trial might make it harder to reproduce something like a clinical perception study, right?
absolutely. Yeah.
It's so I try to remind myself that there's some grace with some of the things that I might be finding, and that if I
Yeah,
find a link study, at the very least, I know that a brand is making an effort in some sort of way.
exactly.
Yeah.
We should be happy. And then also sometimes they are mixing, right? So they have their own study results, and then they are mixing that together with existing literature.
Yeah.
It's a little gray area, right? Because sometimes you have results that are not particularly matching.
Yeah.
But obviously, another study 20 years ago came to the conclusion that this was the result. And now your study came to a different conclusion, also about different things. And then you're mixing and matching, basically. But I think that nothing. And also, one thing that I want to add here as well is that while the randomized control trial is definitely the gold standard and brands should definitely opt for that, I think that it's still expensive. And if a brand has a single group study and that single group study was well designed and includes objective data measurements, includes objective biomarkers, for example, blood markers, sleep sleep data from trackers, for example, or included weight measurements or blood pressure measurements, right? Then this is still a good study. You shouldn't dismiss it just because it's single group.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I think about is it something that's scientifically measurable or is it only feelings and emotions? Because
Yeah.
while placebo effect is a real thing, and as you mentioned, could someone be feeling better because of that supplement or because they're making other changes in their life associated with
Hmm.
positive health outcome, one of those being adding a supplement, but also they're getting more sunlight, they're getting better sleep, they're getting more movement, right? There's a ton of things that they could be doing that's not necessarily associated with that supplement. And so if someone is reporting back perception study, yes, I felt better versus actually checking a scientific, like you're saying, a biomarker. So for example, did the levels of that supplement actually go up either in their urine or in their blood versus it's just my perception that this thing was effective. And that could be because of placebo effect, because, oh, now I feel like I'm taking care of myself. And I think the word placebo effect can sometimes be negatively used, and we don't want to pay for something if all it's doing is giving us a placebo effect for sure. But there's also value for us as humans to get benefit from changes that we're making in our lives or a mindset shift essentially, right? And that giving us a positive outcome. And so I don't want to also demonize the idea of a placebo effect, but
Mhm.
that's where looking at something like a randomized control trial, or if that's not possible, looking at something like biomarkers, for example, there are easy ways to test someone's. So, for example, vitamin C in urine is very easy to test. And so, if I were a supplement that was doing vitamin C, at the very least, I would want to make sure that was being absorbed. And that would be an easy way to do that. Right. And I'm just giving an example for listeners because I know you know, because you're doing it day in and day out. But we want to make sure that what we're paying for and what we're trying to improve our health is actually being delivered by a brand. And otherwise, if I am going to take a vitamin D supplement that is ineffective, I'd be better off going outside and sitting in my front lawn and getting some sunlight, right? So, like, to
Yeah.
be more beneficial. So,
But I also want to quickly mention to the listeners that there are also studies that did not involve biomarkers, but still have objective data measurements in it. So one area, especially in supplements, that's currently very trendy is supplements around focus, attention, memory, right? Brain health, mental health. And how you actually measure that is, in fact, through questionnaire. So there's something called cognitive battery testing. And cognitive battery testing gives you a really great way of objectively measuring something like focus, something like attention, and also memory, for example. So even if a study did not involve biological samples, it could still include objective data measurement. And because you mentioned also the kind of touchy-feely things, right? Subjective data that we see in consumer perception. We also see that sometimes in clinical trials. And we have done a lot of work in women's health, and especially women's health is around subjective feeling. When you're looking at PMS, at menstrual pain, for example, at mood, for example, then oftentimes what we do is we ask questions, and they are actually many validated questionnaires that give us a good understanding if PMS symptoms actually got better versus when we would look at blood, the only thing that really makes sense is inflammation. But again, looking at inflammation, right, your inflammation levels likely won't go down significantly because you take a supplement.
yeah, that's a really good point about, for example, the memory and the focus being something you could tangibly look at. I would think that something like biomarkers in perimenopause would also be hormones or different kinds of
Mhm.
things, not just inflammation. But yeah, it is very complex, right? Even just you and I
Yeah.
sitting here and talking about it, like trying to figure out what are some of the best ways to measure. This is why brands need to partner with someone who specializes in this and that can help them identify if their product truly is performing the way that they want it to perform so that a consumer can buy something to solve the problem that they have, right? If you buy a PMS supplement or a perimenopause supplement, like you're spending money and you want to feel better, whether it's emotionally or physically. And if that brand has partnered with someone to ensure efficacy, it's that much more likely that you will get that result. So I guess the kind of last question I would ask is, while I went onto clinicaltrials.gov, I saw that there was a section where you could check a button to see brands who were recruiting or who were yet to start their study, right? Like, how does a consumer get involved if they want to participate in some of these trials? I know you said at the very beginning, one of the ways that you got into this was in being able to effectively find consumers to participate in some of these studies. So if a listener is listening right now and is, oh, I'm actually wanting to participate in some of this stuff and say whether or not something reduces wrinkles, how do they get started in that?
Yeah, if someone wants to participate in one of our studies, you can fill out our contact form under www.citruslabs.com/contact. And if you need your information there, you will get contacted by one of our research coordinators. And then to participate in the study, you actually need to complete a screener. And if you are a match to one of our studies, then you are invited to participate. It's very easy, but the screeners, they basically check for a study specific inclusion and exclusion criteria. And to participate, you need to be a match to these criteria.
What would they expect in terms of it? I guess it would be dependent on what they would match to a study. And maybe you wouldn't have something right then, but maybe they might be matched in the future. Like, what would they
Yeah.
expect then?
So when you participate, it depends on the study entirely. So some of our studies, right, are consumer perception studies where we just have, where we send product out and then your participants just have to complete a bunch of questionnaires. But then other studies specifically for supplements involve biomarkers. So you would need to go to a lab, get your blood drawn, and then do that at least twice, at least at baseline and endline, what we call. Sometimes we have a midline in the middle of the study as well. And then on top of that, also complete a bunch of questionnaires as well. And then other studies specifically for skin, right, involve coming in for before and after photos, for example. Sometimes we also then do a skin analysis. So it really depends, but I think it's a lot of fun, especially when you're actually interested in supplements and interested in new skincare products and then giving your opinion on something and then also being in the front line of a new product, for example, and seeing how that actually has an impact on your health.
Is there compensation associated with some of
Yeah.
these? Yeah.
There's always compensation associated with these. We don't expect you take something, get blood drawn, go to the office and get a skin analysis, but compensation always depends on what you have to do.
And I would add to that, I think that sometimes brands would argue that, oh, that person was paid to say that the product was effective. And I would hope, and I know for me, if I was participating in a consumer perception study and I had been, compensated with free product and a little bit of money for my time, that wouldn't be enough for me to validate this idea that the system is rigged and everybody's just paying for whatever. That's why you say it's so rare that you see 100% because it's
Yeah,
impossible to make 100% of people happy all the time. I like the phrase, you can be the juiciest peach in the orchard and someone is not going to like peaches.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah, it always
someone is
happens.
gonna, because someone's gonna
Yeah.
complain. Yeah, for sure.
Exactly. And then, especially in perception studies, perception studies are less scientific, but they also ask about how do you like the smell of a product? How do you like the texture of a product? And this is often when things go south because, especially when something has a natural, basically no scent, right? It's a natural scent. Oftentimes, participants feel that it doesn't smell nice. And this is typically where we get lower results.
Everybody's got an
um,
opinion. Yep.
everybody's got an opinion. Yeah. But just because someone gets compensation doesn't mean that the research is rigged, especially when you include objective data measurements. And again, we do not see it a lot that there's 100% on a claim.
I always like to leave listeners with something positive and actionable that they can walk away with to either be of service for themselves or to others. We've talked a lot about this whole process today. I'm wondering if you have a specific recommendation that someone can walk away today and instead of feeling overwhelmed that all the supplements in their cabinets might be problematic, what can we recommend that they do to feel empowered and to help themselves with something simple they can do?
It's not that simple, but I think with COVID, we all got a crash course in epidemiology. And I would suggest instead of buying blindly a product that promises to do X, put your epidemiological hat on and think about, in this particular study, what was the research question? What was the study design? And on which criteria were participants actually selected? And what was the methodology used? The methodology is what kind of data collection did they use? Was it just a bunch of questionnaires? Did it include objective data from biomarkers or from validated questionnaires or probiotics, for example, stool samples, skin swabs, skin analysis? And then, very important, if you do just one thing, see if you can actually find this study on clinicaltrials.gov and just challenge brands to be more transparent about their research.
So when I went to clinicaltrials.gov, because you tell me to do something and I'm such a questioner by nature, I'm like, ooh, this is a tool for me to question, right? And I didn't see a place to search by brand. So what are we looking for when we go there?
So when you go there, focus your search on condition or disease, other terms, intervention treatment, or location. And then you just put the brand name in other terms.
As someone who immediately loves a tool to shake down any sort of information on the internet, I will say that one of the things you and I just chatted about is that it has to be really finite in terms of how you're searching. So when you go to clinicaltrials.gov, there's a box for condition or disease. So, for example, if you um, have a medical condition like psoriasis and you want to see if there's any clinical studies done on products that might be helpful for that, like you could put that in. Or if you're looking for a particular brand, you could go under other terms, but it has to be exactly what the brand name is. And unfortunately, even if you're off by a little bit, it's not going to come up. So just be really careful. And hopefully, I find that going to a brand's website and looking for, oftentimes it's like actually in the footer or under the about the brand, there might be a drop down where they'll share more about the additional work that they do in terms of sustainability is always something that I'm looking for. Inclusivity is something I'm looking for. Safety and efficacy are the other things that I like to find in brands. And so if you can find some of that on their website, oftentimes it will point you to the studies that they've done or things like that. So if you can't find it on clinicaltrials.gov, definitely go to the brand's website. And when I'm in the store, like you said, I am also that person pulling out my phone, looking for all of that information. And I would say all of the things that I've talked about before in terms of transparency still align, right? If you're looking for a brand who's doing the right things, especially as it relates to transparency, looking for a brand that's a B Corp, that means that they have been open in terms of their transparency and doing things right by people on the planet. Looking for a brand that is EWG verified, all of these kinds of things will also help. I don't think supplements are on EWG at this point, but I know cleaning products and skincare are, right? Like these are other ways that you can also find that brands are investing into their products being safe and effective for consumers. And I really enjoyed learning from behind the curtain on what a brand is doing to ensure these things, because I think it also says a lot. And I want to support the brands that are going above and beyond to ensure that they are creating products that are safer. I think it's pathetic that our country doesn't require this as a standard or doesn't even offer it as some sort of standard, right? I envision a world in the future where before a product is put on the shelf, it is tested by some sort of standards, like you were saying, toxicology recommendations or different kinds of things, because it's heartbreaking to me that there are so many products that are, like I said earlier, the most accessible for the majority of Americans that are the most problematic, right? And I think of, for example, the supplements that are found at like the dollar store or different things like that are the ones that we're often finding heavy metals and contaminants. And it's just it just makes me so mad that people are by companies who are not doing the right thing to people. So I appreciate that Citruslabs is helping companies do this in a more affordable way. And I think it's really cool. The day Suzanne Odell's and perception studies, it would be a great place to do that. We also have webinars that you guys have posted. And so we'll put a link in the show notes for you. But at Citrus Labs, they have some recorded. Suzanne, is there anything that we didn't talk about today or that you want to mention before we officially close out?
I think that was an amazing crash course in clinical trials, supplements, clinical trials, and cosmetics. And we talked with mentioned about perception studies. And I think for me, the most important thing that we still have a long way to go is transparency. And a lot of companies, they are transparent, but others are not. So I think when we are thinking of regulations and that it's mind blowing that you don't have to do toxicology testing and don't have to do efficacy testing, it should go hand in hand also with transparency. And when you're looking right now at the landscape of the brands that are actually winning, these are the brands that are transparent and that tell us we have done these tests that, for example, supply chain, in supplements in particular, right? They list where the ingredients actually coming from so that we actually know that so that we can actually understand what's actually in my product. And these are interestingly the brands that are very transparent about their supply chain and the ingredients and where they're coming from are also the ones that are very transparent about their research. So kudos to these brands.
Agreed. And listeners, we put a list of resources to the webinar, to Citrus Labs, to the previous show on Mokra, all of the resources that you might want or need at realeverything.com. And if in the future you'd like to receive your podcast without commercials ad free, go to patreon.com/thewholeview to get all of our shows delivered to your inbox. And it is a great way to support the show that we create and produce ourselves. So I thank you for doing that. Another way to support the show is to leave a review. It costs you nothing except just 30 seconds of your time and makes a huge difference in my being able to continue to do this. Don't forget to follow or subscribe in whatever podcast app you're using. And as always, we appreciate your willingness to be open to grow through your own personal changes, because no one is perfect, but in listening, learning, and unlearning, we can choose to become better versions of ourselves for ourselves. And in this case, hopefully learning how to consume products that are better for us as well. Thank you so much for being here, Suzanne.
Thank you so much for having me.